Ladies and gentlemen, when we speak of intimacy, it's easy to reduce it to a physical act or a romantic gesture. But the truth is far more profound, especially when we consider what a man truly desires in the quiet moments of closeness. First and foremost, a man doesn't simply want to be touched, he wants to be seen. Not for the roles he plays, not for the mask he wears in society, but for the human being behind it all. Beneath the surface of strength is a longing to be met emotionally, to have his internal world acknowledged without judgment. He desires a space where vulnerability is not a liability. In a world that often demands he be stoic, decisive, and unshakable, intimacy offers the rare chance to exhale, to speak fears without ridicule, to reveal weakness without consequence. True closeness allows him to put down his sword and shield, if only for a moment. Intimacy also calls forth a delicate balance within him, for he is not just a provider or a protector. He is also a seeker of tenderness. He wants to express affection, wonder, and emotional nuance without being accused of softness or inadequacy. What a man longs for, more than admiration or desire, is to be recognized beyond his utility. To know that he matters not just for what he does, but for who he is. This recognition allows him to reconnect with the parts of himself he has hidden, even from himself. And intimacy, at its best, is not a transaction. It's not a set of expectations or performances. It is an exploration, a journey two people take into the mystery of each other's interior worlds. He desires a partner in this journey, someone curious, open, and unafraid of the depth he secretly holds. Lastly, and perhaps most profoundly, a man desires a union that transcends the physical. He wants to be known in a way that echoes in the soul. In true intimacy, he is not just touched, he is understood. So the next time we speak of what a man wants, let us go beyond the stereotypes, the locker room myths, and the silence he's been taught to maintain. Because what he really desires in intimacy is something sacred, something real, a connection where he can finally come home to himself and to another. Thank you. When discussing what a man truly desires in intimacy, one of the most misunderstood aspects is his yearning for authentic connection, a space where performance, ego, and expectation fall away. Culturally, men are often conditioned to view intimacy through the lens of achievement, conquest, or functionality. They're taught that their worth in the realm of connection lies in what they do, how well they perform, how much they provide, or how consistently they satisfy. But this conditioning is a distortion. Beneath it lies a much more tender truth. What a man deeply desires is to be in connection, not construction. He wants to be known, not just admired. This desire for authentic connection often gets masked behind surface behaviors. A man may initiate intimacy physically, not necessarily because he is driven purely by desire, but because that is the one avenue where he has been allowed, socially and emotionally, to seek closeness. If emotional vulnerability is off limits, then physicality becomes the only acceptable language. However, within that act, he is often searching for something deeper, emotional affirmation, presence, and a moment of being fully received. To be seen without having to earn that gaze, this is the core of authentic connection. It's the difference between being wanted for who he is versus being wanted for how well he plays the role assigned to him. A man, in his most honest moments, longs to drop the script. He wants intimacy to be a mirror, not a stage. Not a place to impress, perform, or prove, but a sacred space where he can exist as he is, unfiltered, imperfect human. This yearning clashes directly with how many men are socialized. From a young age, they're often taught to separate themselves from their emotions, to prioritize stoicism, and to approach relationships with a mindset of functionality over vulnerability. Even in romantic settings, men are praised for providing, solving, achieving, but rarely for feeling. This leads to a paradox. In intimate situations where emotional honesty would create the deepest connection, many men instead feel pressure to perform, as if the experience depends on their ability to meet some unspoken metric. But performance and presence are opposites. When a man feels that his value is tied to performance, whether emotionally, physically, or otherwise, he becomes split. Part of him tries to engage, while another part monitors, critiques, and adjusts. This internal division robs him of the very connection he seeks. True intimacy cannot coexist with self-surveillance. It requires surrender, not strategy. What he truly desires is the freedom to be in the moment without calculation. He wants to look into the eyes of another and feel that he doesn't need to do anything to be accepted in that gaze. He wants to feel safe enough to bring not just his strength, but his uncertainty, his silence, his hesitation. In that safety, he can access a deeper kind of giving, one that is rooted in truth, not in the pressure to fulfill a role. This is why authentic connection is so healing for men. It challenges the internalized belief that they are only as good as their last success, their last gesture, or their last act of strength. Instead, it says, you matter simply because you exist. It says, your inner world is welcome here. It says, your presence, not your performance, is the bridge between us. In these moments, something profound shifts. The walls come down, not out of weakness, but because there is finally no need for armor. And what emerges is not just a man seeking to be loved, but a human being ready to be real. The safe space to be vulnerable, one of the deepest, yet most hidden, desires a man carries into intimacy is the longing for a place where he can be vulnerable without fear. This desire doesn't come wrapped in grand gestures or poetic confessions. It often hides behind silence, behind guarded eyes, behind the measured way he speaks, yet it pulses constantly beneath the surface. At his core, a man wants a space where he can lower his defenses, loosen his grip on control, and exhale without the weight of judgment pressing against his chest. From early life, most boys are taught that vulnerability is a threat to their survival. Social, emotional, and even physical. Be tough, don't cry, a man up. These messages are repeated like mantras. They're not just words, they become psychological architecture. They build walls around the emotional core. Over time, those walls don't just keep others out, they keep the man himself disconnected from his own emotional experience. By the time he reaches adulthood, he may not even have the language for his inner world, let alone the comfort to reveal it. This is why intimacy holds such potential and such danger for a man. On one hand, it is the one space where his longing to be fully known might actually be fulfilled. On the other, it's the space where that very act of exposure feels the riskiest. To show emotion, to admit fear, to cry, to speak the words, I don't know, or I need help, or I'm scaredy. These are not simply statements. For a man conditioned by strength and self-reliance, they can feel like admissions of defeat. But what he craves is the exact opposite. Not to be defeated, but to be allowed to be soft, momentarily unguarded, and still held in love and respect. Intimacy, when it is real, becomes a kind of sanctuary, not just physically, but emotionally. A man wants to be met in that sanctuary with openness, not analysis. He doesn't need every wound fixed or every story interpreted. He needs someone to witness his truth without flinching. He needs to know that if he lets the tears fall, the world won't collapse around him. That if he shows the parts of himself he's kept hidden for years, maybe decades, he won't be seen as weak, but as whole. For many men, this kind of vulnerability is not triggered by crisis alone. It comes in small moments. The way he hesitates before revealing something from his past. The quiet after he says he's fine when he's anything but. The softening in his voice when he talks about someone he's lost or something he regrets. These moments may seem subtle, but they are monumental. They are acts of trust. And in those moments, he is watching to see if the space between him and his partner is safe enough to continue. That safety doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It means listening without rushing to fix peace between him and his partner. It means staying when he retreats emotionally and inviting rather than interrogating. It means being patient with his silences and knowing they don't always mean withdrawal. They often mean he is struggling to find a way to be honest without falling apart. It also means holding the paradox that he may be both strong and hurting, composed and overwhelmed, masculine and still deeply tender inside. What a man longs for is not to be rescued, but to be received, to be allowed the full scope of his human experience without having to fight for the right to feel. In a world that constantly demands he keep his armor on, he wants, more than anything, for intimacy to be the one place where he can finally set it down and still be safe. Integration of strength and softness, one of the most profound yet often overlooked desires a man holds in intimacy, is the freedom to express both his strength and his softness, without either part being dismissed, diminished, or misunderstood. Deep within him lives a tension between two seemingly opposing forces. the instinct to protect, lead, and provide, and the quiet longing to nurture, surrender, and be emotionally attuned. True intimacy offers the possibility to reconcile these energies, not in conflict but in harmony. Masculinity, as traditionally portrayed, is often filtered through a narrow spectrum: power, control, logic, and independence. These traits, when healthy, are not inherently problematic. But when they become the only acceptable expressions of being a man, they create a lopsided identity. Men are then pressured to suppress the equally vital capacities within them: empathy, tenderness, emotional sensitivity, and receptivity. These softer traits are not weaknesses. They are human, and yet many men learn early on that showing them comes with risk. Risk of being ridiculed, invalidated, or even rejected. This division shows up most clearly in intimate relationship. A man may feel confident in his ability to protect or provide for his partner, yet uncertain when it comes to revealing his inner world. He may be comfortable solving problems, but deeply uncomfortable being emotionally exposed. And so he hesitates, not because he doesn't care, but because the language of softness, the ability to express feelings, to hold emotional space, to lean into vulnerability, has often been discouraged, if not outright punished. Yet he does not want to be reduced to a protector or a fixer. He desires the space to bring his full self into intimacy, the part of him that can stand firm in adversity, and the part of him that aches quietly in the night. He wants to love not just with action, but with emotion. He wants to cry without shame. He wants to feel deeply and be felt in return. His desire is not to abandon his strength, but to include his softness, to become whole rather than fractured. This integration, however, requires an environment of trust. When a man dares to reveal his emotional depth, he is often doing so against years of internal resistance. He may not even fully understand what he's feeling. He just knows that something inside wants to be expressed. In those moments, he's not asking for solutions. He's seeking a space where both his strength and his fragility can coexist. He wants to know that being emotionally open won't cost him respect or admiration, that he won't be seen as less of a man for being fully human, human. Partners often play a critical role in this unfolding. When a man feels accepted in both his roles, the one who stands tall and the one who sometimes crumbles, he begins to trust intimacy more deeply. He stops seeing emotional expression as a liability and starts experiencing it as connection. He begins to understand that real strength isn't the absence of feeling, but the courage to bring feeling into the open. This duality lives in every man, the archetype of the warrior who fights to protect and the archetype of the lover who longs to connect. When one is emphasized at the expense of the other, imbalance and inner conflict arise. And when both are allowed to breathe, when he can hold his partner close not just with arms, but with words, with presence, with softness, he becomes something far more powerful than a role or stereotype. He becomes a full expression of the human experience, grounded in depth, alive in connection, and capable of intimacy that doesn't rely on dominance or detachment recognition. Beyond utility, at the heart of a man's longing in intimacy is the need to be recognized, not merely for what he does, but for who he is. So often, his sense of worth becomes intertwined with his output, his ability to provide, to solve problems, to keep things together. This is a role many men wear with quiet pride and often silent exhaustion. But beneath this conditioning is a deeper, often unspoken desire to be seen and valued not just as a function, not just as a role filler, but as a person with complexity, emotion, and interior depth. From an early age, many men receive messages that their value comes from their ability to produce results. In relationships, this often translates into being the fixer, the planner, the supporter, or the silent backbone. In families, it might be about carrying responsibility, staying composed, and being the rock. While these roles are not inherently negative, when they become the only lens through which a man is acknowledged, he begins to feel invisible as a person. He starts to wonder, if I stop doing, will I stop mattering? This is especially true in intimacy, where emotional closeness requires not just contribution, but visibility. A man wants to feel like more than a paycheck, more than a problem solver, more than someone who shows up with answers. He wants to be known for the nuances within him, For the dreams he doesn't always speak aloud, the feelings he wrestles with quietly, the inner world he keeps hidden because he's unsure anyone truly wants to see it. His actions may speak love, but he also wants to be loved in return for more than those actions. The burden of utility creates a subtle, painful trap. When a man feels he is only valued for his usefulness, intimacy becomes conditional. He may find himself constantly striving to stay relevant in his relationship, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear that if he stops achieving, he will stop deserving connection. Over time, this breeds quiet resentment, disconnection, and a sense of being replaceable. He may stop opening up altogether, unsure whether his inner self has a place in the relationship, but what he truly longs for is something far more human than performance. He wants recognition, not applause, not admiration, recognition, to be seen clearly, wholly, and with compassion, to be acknowledged when he is not producing, to be asked, "How are you really feeling?" and to know that the answer matters, even if it's messy or uncertain. This kind of recognition feeds something vital in him. The belief that he is worthy of love and belonging just as he is, not as he performs. Many men carry deep emotional fatigue from years, sometimes decades, of performing their worth. Intimacy becomes the one place they hope to lay that performance down. But doing so requires the assurance that they will not be judged or discarded for their humanity. When a partner reflects back to a man that his thoughts, feelings, and simply his being are of value, something within him softens. He begins to relax into the relationship, trusting that he is no longer earning love through utility, but receiving it through presence. This recognition does not demand grand gestures. It often lives in small, sacred moments, when he is held without needing to speak, when his silence is not interpreted as failure, when he is invited to bring more of himself to the table, not just his skills or his solutions. It's when his story matters as much as his strength, when his softness is met with curiosity instead of discomfort, and when he knows that he is cherished not for what he gives, but for who he is, when he simply stops trying to give anything at all. Mutual exploration. Not expectation. One of the most misunderstood aspects of male intimacy is the quiet desire for exploration rather than obligation, for the freedom to unfold within connection, instead of performing within a set of assumed expectations. Too often, men enter relationships where roles are already defined, desires are pre-scripted, and they are expected to show up in ways that confirm rather than question what intimacy should look like. But at his core, a man wants something deeper, something less choreographed. He wants mutual discovery. He wants intimacy that is alive, fluid, and responsive, a shared journey rather than a checklist to be fulfilled. Expectations are not inherently harmful. Every relationship needs boundaries, agreements, and a shared sense of direction. But when intimacy becomes governed primarily by unspoken or rigid assumptions about how a man should act, feel, initiate, or express, then something essential is lost. The connection becomes transactional, and the space for real emotional unfolding is replaced by performance. A man may find himself stuck in the tension between who he is and who he's supposed to be, rarely having room to explore that difference with his partner. What he deeply desires instead is a space where he doesn't have to already know everything. He wants a partner who is not just looking for him to fulfill a role, but is genuinely curious about who he is becoming. Intimacy, in its richest form, is not about certainty, it's about revelation. He wants to be with someone who invites him into new emotional landscapes, who meets him not with expectations, but with wonder. In a culture that often defines masculinity by certainty, confidence, and control, men are rarely encouraged to be curious in relationships. They're expected to lead, to know, to initiate, to satisfy, to provide. But what if intimacy became a shared exploration instead, where both partners brought their questions, their hesitations, their shifting identities to the table without fear? This is the kind of space where men begin to open up, not just sexually, but emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. They want to be invited into that space, not pushed into a corner where their worth is measured against how closely they adhere to a script. For many men, there is a quiet ache to be explored, to have someone ask questions not just about their goals or desires, but about their inner life. What do you fear? What makes you feel alive? What do you struggle to say out loud? These are not questions asked with an agenda. They are invitations into depth. When a man feels that he can be discovered instead of judged, he begins to trust the intimacy. He no longer fears that getting it wrong will cost him the relationship. Instead, he sees that the relationship itself is a container for evolution, not perfection. This longing for mutual exploration also touches the physical realm. In a culture saturated with sexual performance standards, many men feel pressure to meet unrealistic ideals of stamina, desire, and certainty. But what they long for is not an endless performance, it's a co-created experience. They want a partner who is attuned to presence rather than outcome, who is open to experimenting, learning, adjusting, and connecting in real time. They want to know that intimacy isn't something they have to master, but something they can grow into, together. When intimacy is rooted in mutual exploration, it becomes a dynamic, evolving connection. There is space for awkwardness, playfulness, mystery, and growth. A man can be both teacher and student, both strong and uncertain, both passionate and tender. He is no longer cast in a role. He is invited into a dance, one that moves not by steps memorized, but by steps discovered in rhythm with another spiritual and psychological union beyond physical closeness, beyond emotional compatibility, and even beyond intellectual connection. A man often carries a quiet, unspoken longing for something harder to define, a kind of soul-level union that merges both spiritual and psychological intimacy. This longing doesn't always arrive with language. It may emerge as a subtle restlessness, a sense that something deeper is missing even when the relationship appears on the surface. At the core of this yearning is the desire to be fully known, not just as a partner, a lover, or a provider, but as a whole being with layers, contradictions, and a complex inner world that longs to be met, not just managed. This kind of connection goes far beyond the idea of a chemistry or shared interests. It's about resonance. A man wants to be with someone who not only listens to what he says, but senses what he doesn't say. Someone who can hold space for both his spoken thoughts and his silent complexities. He wants to be in a relationship where his depths are not overwhelming, where he doesn't need to dilute his emotional or philosophical layers to be digestible. What he longs for is recognition on the level of essence, not just personality. And psychological union begins when a man feels safe enough to bring his shadow into the light, not just his socially accepted qualities, but also the parts of him that are confused, conflicted, angry, or afraid. These aspects are often buried under years of emotional suppression and identity performance. But in a relationship rooted in psychological safety, those hidden parts find a home. He wants to explore the depths of his psyche not alone, but in the presence of someone who is not frightened by his emotional intensity or complexity. Someone who does not need him to always be clear or composed to be worthy of closeness. This depth of union is not passive. It requires two people who are each willing to examine themselves honestly and offer that self-awareness in service of the connection. For a man, this often means unlearning what he's been taught about control, about detachment, about what intimacy should look like. He wants to stop performing and start experiencing. He wants to be met with curiosity, not correction, with openness, not instruction. He wants a partner who is doing their own inner work and invites him to do the same, not as a project, but as a mutual journey of transformation. Spiritual union deepens this further. It's not necessarily about religion or belief systems. It's about connection on a level that feels beyond words, where being together feels like alignment, where silence can be as full as conversation, where the space between two people becomes sacred simply because of the truth that lives there. A man may not always know how to name this need, but he feels it when he senses that intimacy is more than shared routines or romantic gestures. He feels it when he can look into someone's eyes and see that they see him all the way through, not as a concept, not as a role, but as a presence. This kind of union allows him to drop deeper into himself as well. The more spiritually safe and psychically aligned he feels, the more he accesses aspects of his being that remain dormant in shallow connections. He begins to reveal not just his thoughts, but his intuitions, his longings, his existential questions. He becomes capable of a love that isn't just affection, but communion, a shared space where both people are simultaneously witnessing and being witnessed, each drawing out something sacred in the other.